Fluorescent light above my bed hummed the way it always did at night, that low electric whine that never quite went away no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. I lay on my back in a hospital gown 2 sizes too big, staring at the ceiling tiles and counting the tiny pinholes in them because I had nothing else to count. My arm was hooked to an IV that dripped slowly, steadily, like a metronome set to the rhythm of a life that was no longer mine. I had been in this room for 9 days. I knew the pattern of every monitor, the exact pitch of every beep, the precise moment the night nurse would pass my door on her rounds. I knew all of it because no one else had come to break the silence. The nurse came in around midnight and checked the chart at the foot of my bed. Her face was kind but tired, the kind of tired that came from years of holding other people's hands when they were scared. She looked up at me and said gently that the doctor wanted me to undergo another procedure the following afternoon. There were complications, she explained, things that had appeared in my latest blood work that needed to be addressed before I could safely be discharged. I nodded, because that was what I had learned to do in this place. Nod. Listen. Pretend I understood. Then I asked the only question that really mattered to me. How much will it cost? She hesitated, and that small hesitation told me more than the number ever could. When she finally answered, the figure she gave was enormous. It was larger than anything I had ever seen on a single line of a paper. It was larger than 6 months of rent in my tiny apartment, larger than any paycheck I had ever brought home from the long shifts at the diner where I worked double weekends. I felt the number settle into my chest like a stone dropped into still water. It terrified me in a way that the diagnosis had not. The diagnosis was something my body was doing to me. The cost was something my life could not survive. I waited until the nurse left the room, and then I reached, with a shaking hand, for the small handbag that sat on the rolling tray beside my bed. Inside was my phone. The screen lit up, and I opened my banking app with a thumb that did not feel like it belonged to me. The number in my account stared back at me with the patience of a thing that does not lie. Almost nothing remained. The savings I had built up slowly over 2 years of working late nights and refusing to buy myself even a small coffee on the way home, all of it had been eaten by the first rounds of treatment. What was left would not cover the procedure. What was left would barely cover a cab ride home, if I ever got to go home again. I set the phone down carefully, as if it were made of glass, and I lay back against the thin pillow. My throat felt tight. I picked the phone up again and scrolled through my contacts, looking for a name, any name, that might answer if I called. I pressed the first one, rang 4 times, and then went to voicemail. I pressed the second. It rang twice and disconnected, pressed a third and a fourth, and each time the result was the same indifferent ringing that ended in nothing. One cousin texted back a single line that said she was sorry but she could not help right now. An old friend from school did not reply at all. A number I had not dialed in years simply rang into empty air. I closed the contact list and stared at my own reflection in the dark screen. I had not realized until that moment how completely alone I really was. There had been a slow erosion, a thinning of names over the years, and I had not noticed until the moment I actually needed one of them to be there. The realization settled over me like a cold sheet. I had no family beside me. I had no money left. I had no visitors, and no one waiting for me on the other side of any of these walls. The hospital room, with its humming lights and its faint antiseptic smell, had become the only home I had. I let the phone rest on my chest, and I closed my eyes. And I tried to remember the last time someone had asked me how I was feeling and really wanted the answer. I could not remember. That was the loneliest thought I had ever had. I rang for the nurse a few minutes later because there was no point in waiting. When she came, I told her, as calmly as I could, that I would leave as soon as I could. I would sign whatever paper she needed me to sign. I would go. I could not afford to stay any longer, and I would not let the bill grow into something larger than my entire life. She looked at me for a long moment, the way someone looks at a child who has just said something they should not have to say at their age. Then she shook her head. She told me gently but firmly that I could not leave, that the doctor would not allow it, that my body needed another procedure, and that leaving against medical advice was not something anyone in this building would permit. I tried to argue. I tried to explain. She put her hand on my shoulder for one brief second, and then she walked out. I listened to the soft tap of her shoes down the hallway until the sound disappeared around a corner. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark and listened to the beeping of the monitor beside me, and I watched the slow drip of the IV, and I waited for morning, because morning was the only thing that was still mine. The hours passed one by one, and somewhere around 3 in the morning I started to weep very quietly, so quietly that no one would have heard me even if they had been standing in the doorway. I let the tears run down my temples and into the pillow because there was no one there to wipe them away. And because the body will do what the body will do, even when the mind has already accepted that nothing can be done. A little before dawn the door opened again. I expected the nurse. It was not the nurse, it was the hospital administrator. A tall woman in a dark blazer whose face I recognized from a brief meeting on my first day. She carried no chart, she carried no paperwork. She walked to the foot of my bed and looked at me with an expression I could not read. And then she said the words that changed the entire shape of my life. "You don't owe the hospital anything." I stared at her in confusion. I did not understand. I had been running the math in my head for hours. I had calculated the cost of the procedure. I had calculated the cost of the nights I had already spent in this room. I had calculated every possible scenario, and every single one of them ended with a number that I could never pay. I blinked at her and waited for the part that made sense, the part that explained what I had misunderstood. She only repeated what she had said, gently, as if she understood that the words had been too large for me to take in the first time. I was sitting up in bed now, the thin blanket pulled around my waist, my hands gripping the rails on either side of me. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. I could not form a single question, because the only question that mattered felt too impossible to ask out loud. I finally asked it anyway. I asked her who had paid the bill. My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. She looked at me, and then at the floor, and then back at me, and I could see in her eyes the apology that arrived before the words. She told me she could not tell me. She said the donor had requested complete anonymity. She said the gift had come with a single instruction, that I was never to know who had done it unless that person chose to introduce himself. I told her I could not accept such a large gift from a stranger, that there had to be some mistake, that this could not possibly be real. She told me the payment had already been processed. She told me it had cleared the hospital's accounts at 4 in the morning. She told me the donor had paid not just the procedure but every night I had spent in the room, every test, every consultation, every medication, every cent. I sat very still on the bed while she spoke, and I felt the room spin in a slow, careful circle around me. I became suspicious almost immediately. There were very few people in this city who could write a check that large without thinking, and none of them were people who spent their time quietly helping strangers in hospital beds. I asked her what kind of man does something like this, but she said she could not answer that either. I asked her why anyone would want to remain anonymous after giving away so much money. She said she could not speak for the donor, only for herself. I asked her, with the last thread of my composure, what I was supposed to do now. She said I was supposed to rest. She said I was supposed to let the doctors do their work. She said I was supposed to get better. Then she gave me a small, tight smile and walked out of the room, and the door closed behind her with the soft click of something that had been decided long before I had been asked to agree. I lay back against the pillow. My heart was beating very fast. I turned my head to the side and looked at the window, where the first thin line of daylight was beginning to outline the rooftops of the city. Somewhere out there, beyond this building, beyond this room, a person I had never met had decided that I was worth saving. I did not know what to do with that thought. I closed my eyes and held it the way you would hold a coin in the dark, turning it over and over between your fingers, trying to read what was stamped on it without being able to see. The next morning, after the doctor had made his rounds and the new IV had been started, and the breakfast tray had been taken away untouched, I noticed something strange. There were 2 men in dark suits standing at the end of the corridor outside my room. They were not nurses, they were not orderlies. They were standing the way people stand when they have been told to stand very still and not move, with their hands folded in front of them and their eyes on the hallway. I tried to ignore them at first. I told myself that hospitals sometimes hired private security, that it had nothing to do with me. But when the second pair of men arrived an hour later and took up positions further down the corridor, I knew that it did. A black car pulled up outside the hospital entrance sometime before noon. I only knew this because I could hear the low murmur of voices out at the nurses' station, and because one of the orderlies walked past my door with the hurried look that people wear when something important is happening nearby. The car was long and polished and very quiet. The kind of car that does not make a sound when it moves because it does not need to. I sat up straighter in bed. I pulled the thin blanket over my shoulders, and I watched the doorway, the way you watch a doorway when you have begun to suspect that whatever is about to come through it will change the rest of your life. He stepped into the doorway first. A man. Tall. broad shoulders under a dark coat that fell to his knees, dark hair pushed back from his face, just beginning to silver at the temples, eyes that looked like they had seen every kind of trouble this city had ever produced, and had decided, long ago, which ones were worth his time. He stood at the threshold of my room without coming in, and he looked at me the way a man looks at a thing he has come to settle. I recognized him almost immediately. There was no one in this city who did not. His face had been on the front pages of newspapers. His name had been spoken in courtrooms and at kitchen tables and on the lips of people who would never dare to speak it out loud. The most feared man in the city was standing outside my hospital room. I gripped the rails on either side of my bed. I told myself that I was not afraid, and I told myself that I was not surprised, and I told myself that some part of me had suspected all along that the kind of money that could clear an entire hospital bill in one night did not come from ordinary places. I asked him, with a voice that only trembled a little, whether it had been him. He did not deny it. He looked at me for a long, quiet moment, and then he gave a single nod, the smallest possible movement of his head. I asked him why he had done it. I asked him why he had paid the bill of a woman he did not know, in a hospital on the far side of the city, for a procedure he had no reason to care about. He stepped into the room then, slowly, the way someone steps into a space they have thought about for a long time. He pulled the chair from the corner of the room and placed it beside my bed and sat down in it. He folded his hands in his lap, and then he answered, simply and without ceremony. Because you needed help. I told him I did not want charity. I told him that whatever he thought he was buying with that kind of money, I was not for sale. I told him that I had worked for every dollar I had ever earned, and that I did not intend to owe a single cent to anyone, least of all a man whose name made other men lower their voices. He looked at me while I spoke, and he did not interrupt me, and he did not defend himself, and when I had finished he only said one more sentence. He said it calmly. He said it as if he had been waiting a long time to say it. It wasn't charity. I became confused. I asked him what he meant by that. I asked him what else he could possibly call it. He leaned forward a little in the chair, and his eyes softened in a way I had never seen in any photograph of him, and he began to speak. He told me that he had seen me weeks earlier, outside a small restaurant not far from my apartment. He told me that he had been sitting in the back of his car, waiting for a man he was about to meet, when I had walked past the window. He told me that I had stopped on the sidewalk because an elderly woman had dropped her groceries, and that I had knelt down on the pavement and helped her pick them up, one by one, and then I had walked her across the street and made sure she was steady on her feet before I let her go. He told me that when he had looked into my handbag, because he was in the habit of looking carefully at people who crossed his path, he had seen that I had almost nothing in it. He told me that he had known, even then, that the small bills I had given the woman had been almost the last of what I had. He told me that he had watched me walk away with my empty handbag under my arm, and that he had not been able to stop thinking about me since. I stared at him. I remembered that day. I remembered the old woman with the heavy grocery bags. I remembered the way her hands had shaken when she tried to lift them. I remembered that I had given her the last cash in my wallet because I had not been able to live with the alternative. I had not thought about it at the time. I had not thought about it since. It had been a small thing. It had been the kind of small thing that you do without counting it, the kind of small thing that you forget almost as soon as it has happened. But he had not forgotten it. He had carried it with him for weeks. He had paid my hospital bill because of it. You helped someone when you had almost nothing, he said. I wanted to return the favor. I was speechless. I sat in the hospital bed with the blanket around my shoulders and the IV in my arm, and I tried to speak, and nothing came out. I had been given so many explanations for kindness in my life, so many reasons, so many strings, so many small invisible prices attached to every helping hand that I had ever taken. And now this man whose name made an entire city lower its voice, was telling me that he had helped me because of a single act of kindness I had not even remembered committing. I did not know what to do with that. I did not know what to do with any of it. I realized, slowly, that he had noticed me long before I had ever noticed him. I realized that somewhere in the back of a black car, on a street I would not have been able to name if you had asked me, this powerful and feared man had looked at me and had seen something he had not seen in a long time. He had seen someone who gave without expecting anything back. He had seen someone whose instinct, when faced with another person's need, was to kneel down on the pavement and help, even when her own pockets were empty. He had been carrying the image of me ever since. He had been carrying it the way you carry a photograph that you cannot bring yourself to put away. I asked him, with a voice that was smaller than I wanted it to be, why he had never approached me before, why he had waited until I was in a hospital bed, alone and afraid, before he had crossed the distance between us. He looked at the floor for a long moment. He looked like a man who had thought about the answer to this question a great many times. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. Because I didn't want you to think my money was the reason you mattered to me. I felt my eyes fill with tears. I blinked them back as hard as I could, but they came anyway, sliding down my cheeks and dropping onto the thin blanket. I did not wipe them away. I let them fall. I let him see them, because there was no point in pretending anymore, and because he had already seen more of me in the last 5 minutes than anyone else had seen in years. He reached across the space between the chair and the bed, and he put his hand over mine, very gently, the way you would put a hand over a candle flame if you wanted to feel its warmth without putting it out. He promised me, in a voice that sounded like it had never made this kind of promise before, that nobody would pressure me to repay him. He promised me that the bill was a gift and nothing more. He promised me that I would never owe him a single cent, and that no one in his organization would ever contact me, and that the only thing he wanted from me in this moment was to see me get better. I asked him what he actually wanted. I asked him because I needed to know, because I had been raised to know the price of every gift before I accepted it. He looked at me and he gave me the honest answer. It came out slowly, and it came out in a voice that sounded as if it had not been used for honest things in a very long time. Nothing. I just wanted you to live long enough to have the choice to decide what you want. I closed my eyes. I let the words settle into me. I did not say anything for a long time, because there was nothing to say. He stayed in the chair beside my bed, and I stayed in the bed. And the hospital went on with its quiet routines outside the door, and for the first time in 9 days I was not alone. The days that followed moved differently. The procedure was done, and the doctors were cautiously pleased, and the numbers on the monitors began to climb back into the ranges that they had been before. I recovered slowly, the way bodies recover when they have finally been given permission to. He came to see me every day, always at the same time, always alone. He never brought guards into the room. He never brought flowers or gifts or any of the small decorations that other visitors brought. He brought himself, and that was enough. He sat in the chair beside my bed, and he talked to me about the small things that had happened in his day, the way people talk when they are no longer used to being heard. I learned that he had a sister who lived in another country. I learned that he had not taken a vacation in 11 years. I learned that he read books late at night when he could not sleep, and that he preferred the ones with unhappy endings. Because, he said, the unhappy ones at least told the truth. The bodyguard who stood at the end of the corridor watched all of this with the careful attention of a man who had been trained to read situations for danger. He had been against me at first. I could see it in the way he looked at me when he thought I was not watching, the way he positioned himself between the door and the bed when he thought something might happen. He thought I was a risk. He thought I was a distraction. He thought that whatever his employer had begun to feel for me was a kind of mistake that could not end well. I understood his caution. I understood it because I had spent my whole life being cautious in the same way. But he began to change. He began to change the night he heard me laugh. Really laugh. For the first time since I had been admitted. The man at the foot of my bed had said something small and absurd about a pigeon he had seen on the hospital roof that morning. And I had laughed so suddenly that the sound surprised both of us, and the bodyguard in the corridor had looked in through the glass window of my door with an expression I would never forget. It was the expression of a man who has just realized, after a very long time, that his employer is happy. He stepped back into the shadows of the corridor, and he did not move again for the rest of the night. The next morning he brought me a small cup of tea from the cafeteria without being asked, and when he set it down on the tray beside my bed he gave me the smallest nod, as if to say that he had decided, at last, that I was allowed to be there. The afternoon I was discharged, the doctor signed the final forms, and the nurse gathered my few belongings into a small plastic bag, and the administrator came by one last time to wish me well. She did not mention the bill. She did not mention the man who had paid it. She only said that she was glad I was leaving in better shape than I had arrived, and that she hoped I would not need to come back. I thanked her. I meant it more than I could say. I changed out of the hospital gown and into the clothes that had been folded into the bag, and I walked slowly down the corridor on legs that still felt unfamiliar to me, and I passed the place where the bodyguards had stood, and the place where the administrator had first told me the bill was paid, and I stepped out into the bright daylight of a city that looked, somehow, completely different from the city I had entered 9 days earlier. He was waiting for me outside the hospital, not with a fleet of cars, not with guards surrounding the entrance, just one car. Just him. He was standing beside it with his hands in the pockets of his coat, and the wind was moving his hair across his forehead, in a way that made him look younger than any photograph had ever made him look. He turned when he heard the door open, and he looked at me, and he smiled, and the smile was so unexpected and so private that I felt my breath catch in my chest. I walked toward him. I asked him, as I reached the edge of the sidewalk, why he had really come here, why he was really standing on this piece of pavement in the middle of the afternoon, in front of this particular hospital, waiting for this particular woman. He looked at me quietly for a long time, the way he had looked at me on the first afternoon in my room, the way he looked at things that mattered. Then he spoke, and his voice was low, and the words came out the way a person sets down a thing they have been holding for a long time. The first time I saw you, you were helping someone who couldn't help you back. He paused. The wind moved again. A small leaf turned over at the edge of the curb and then kept going down the street. I thought that kind of kindness was rare. I smiled at him. I did not know what else to do with my face. I had not been smiled at, in return, by anyone in a very long time, and the feeling of it moved through me like sunlight through a window. "And now?" I asked. He looked at me for another long, quiet moment. Then he held out his hand to me. I looked at his hand, and then I looked at his face, and then I looked at his hand again. He had not reached for me like that before. He had put his hand over mine, yes, but he had never offered it to me. There was a difference, and I understood it, and I understood everything that came with it. I reached out, and I took his hand. His fingers closed around mine. They were warm. They were steady. They were the hands of a man who had decided, with absolute certainty, that he was not letting go. Now, I think I was lucky enough to find it. We stood together on the sidewalk for a moment, his hand in mine, the hospital behind us, and the city in front of us, and the whole long, uncertain future somewhere in between. Then we turned together toward the waiting car, and we walked toward it slowly, two people who had been strangers a few weeks earlier, and were now something that neither of us had a name for yet. The car door opened. The engine purred. The hospital grew smaller in the rearview mirror as we pulled away, and then it disappeared around a corner, and then it was gone. The city unfolded around us, block by block, light by light. And somewhere behind us a nurse closed the door of an empty room and ran a hand across the freshly made bed, and somewhere inside the building an administrator filed the last of the paperwork in a folder she would never open again, and somewhere in a corridor a bodyguard folded his hands in front of him and walked away with the small, private satisfaction of a man who had finally understood what his employer had been searching for all along. The fluorescent light above that empty bed went on humming. No one was listening to it anymore. The car moved through the city in a hush that felt almost ceremonial. The way the world goes quiet when something important has just begun. I sat in the back seat with my hands folded in my lap and watched the streets slide past the tinted glass like a film. I was not entirely sure I was inside. The hospital had grown smaller in the mirror, and then it was gone, and in its place came the slow, ordinary city, the same city I had walked through every day for years, only now it looked back at me with the strange softness of a place that had witnessed something it was not yet ready to name. He sat beside me, his shoulders steady, his hand resting on his thigh with the calm of someone who had long ago learned how to be still in a moving vehicle. He did not speak. He did not need to. The silence between us was not empty. It was the kind of silence that has weight, the kind that is shaped by everything that has already been said. The driver turned onto a road I did not recognize, a road lined with old plane trees whose leaves had not yet begun to turn. The light came through them in long, broken bars across the windshield, and I watched the bars move and then move again, and I thought about how strange it was that I had no idea where I was going. I had been discharged from a hospital I could not pay for, into a car I had never seen before, beside a man whose name made an entire city lower its voice, and I had followed him without asking the destination, the way you follow someone when you have finally decided to trust them. I had not made that decision out loud. I had not even made it consciously. It had been made somewhere deeper, in the place where the body knows things before the mind has found the words for them. The car slowed. We turned through a pair of tall iron gates that opened without sound. And then we were moving up a long driveway lined with low boxwood hedges that had been trimmed into perfect rectangles. At the end of the driveway stood a house I did not recognize at first because it did not look the way I had expected his house to look. I had imagined, without admitting it to myself, something dark and heavy, something that matched the photographs of him I had seen in newspapers, all black cars and smoked glass, and the sharp angles of a man who had built his life out of warning. The house that stood at the end of the driveway was not that. It was a low, pale stone building with wide windows and a slate roof that had weathered into the soft color of rain. There were wisteria vines climbing up one side of it, half in bloom, half not, and a gravel path that curved around a small fountain. I could hear before I could see. The whole place felt older than he was, as if it had been waiting for someone to come back to it for a long time. The driver stopped the car. The engine went quiet. He did not move to get out, and neither did I. We sat there for a moment, side by side, and he looked at the house the way a man looks at a thing he has not been sure he was allowed to keep. Then he turned to me and said, in a voice that was almost shy, almost careful, that this was where he had grown up. He said it had been his mother's house once. He said she had died 10 years ago, and he had kept it exactly the way she had left it, because he had never been able to bring himself to change a single piece of furniture in it. He said he was telling me this because he did not want me to walk into a stranger's home. He said he wanted me to walk into the place he had come from. The difference, he said quietly, mattered to him. I opened the door of the car, and I stepped out onto the gravel, and the air smelled of cut grass and wisteria, and the faint mineral cold of the fountain, and I understood, in a way that I had not understood anything in a long time, that he had brought me here because he trusted me, not the way a man trusts a witness, or an ally, or a useful acquaintance. He trusted me the way a man trusts a person he has decided, against every instinct that has kept him alive until now, to let inside the last quiet room he still owned. I did not speak. I only nodded once and walked beside him up the path. The front door was unlocked. He opened it himself, without knocking, the way a person opens a door that is still, even after all these years, the door of his own home. Inside, the air was cool and still, and it carried the soft smell of old wood and lemon oil, and the faintest trace of something floral that had long ago been pressed into the linen of a curtain. There was a hallway with framed photographs along the walls, most of them black and white, most of them of people I did not know. A young woman with his same dark eyes smiled out of one frame. An older couple stood in front of a church in another. He paused at the third photograph, the one at the end of the hall, and I saw him look at it for a moment longer than he looked at the others. He did not explain it. I did not ask. Some doors a person only opens when he is ready, and I had already understood that I was going to let him set the pace. He led me into a sitting room at the back of the house, where tall French doors opened out onto a lawn that rolled down toward a low stone wall, and, beyond it, the silver line of a river I had not known was there. There were books on every surface. There were books stacked on the floor in leaning towers beside chairs that did not match, and books shelved into the corners of the room in shelves that had clearly been added one at a time over many years. He apologized for the mess, and I told him that it did not look like a mess to me. It looked like a life. He looked at me when I said that, and for a moment the expression on his face was so unguarded that I had to look away, because I felt I was seeing something I had not been meant to see. He asked me if I would like something to eat. I said I would, because the truth was that I had not had a real meal in 9 days, and because I wanted to give him something ordinary to do, a small task that would let him settle back into the rhythms of his own house. He went into the kitchen, and I heard the sound of a refrigerator door opening and closing, and then the soft click of a gas burner being lit and the faint clatter of a pan being set down on a grate. I stayed in the sitting room. I walked slowly along the bookshelves, trailing my fingers along the spines of books I would never read and books I would. I came to a small framed photograph on a low table beside the window. It was a picture of him, much younger, standing on the lawn outside this very house, beside a woman who was laughing and holding his arm. His mother, I guessed. I did not pick it up. I only looked at it, and then I turned away, because it was not mine to hold yet. He called me into the kitchen a few minutes later. There was a small table set with 2 plates, 2 forks, 2 glasses, and a bowl of something that smelled of tomatoes and basil. He had cooked it himself, quickly and without ceremony, the way a man cooks when he has been cooking for himself for a long time and has stopped performing for anyone. We sat across from each other. He watched me take the first bite, and I watched him watch me, and I understood, for the second time that day, that this man had been alone for a long time in a way that had nothing to do with the size of his house or the number of his guards. We did not speak much during the meal. The food was simple and warm, and we ate it the way 2 people eat when they have already said the most important things and now have to learn how to fill the smaller spaces between them. I learned that he put salt on everything, and that he did not like the pitted olives from the jar at the back of the refrigerator, and that he drank his water without ice even in summer. I learned that he listened when I spoke, and that he tilted his head slightly to the left when he was thinking about what I had said, and that he laughed, when he laughed at all, from somewhere deep in his chest, the way a man laughs when he is surprised into it. After we had eaten, he asked me if I wanted to see the rest of the house. I told him I did. He took me through it slowly, room by room, the way a guide takes someone through a museum he has loved since he was a child. There was a library with floor-to-ceiling shelves and a rolling ladder on a brass rail. There was a small music room with a piano whose lid had been left open, the keys yellowed with age, a single piece of sheet music still propped on the stand as if someone had just stepped away from it. There was a dining room with a long table that could seat 12 and only 6 chairs around it, because his mother, he said, had never liked the way more than 6 people sounded in a room. There was a sunroom at the back, glass on 3 sides, with wicker chairs and a low table covered in old issues of magazines he had never thrown away. There was a small bedroom on the second floor that had been his when he was a boy, and he opened the door to it slowly, almost apologetically, as if he were letting me into something that had been sealed for decades. The room was small and plain. There was a single bed with a navy coverlet, a wooden desk with a chipped inkwell, a poster of a sailing ship taped to one wall, and a window that looked out over the same lawn and the same river I had seen from below. There were books on the floor, even here, paperbacks with cracked spines that had been read and reread so many times their covers had gone soft. He did not come into the room. He stood in the doorway with his shoulder against the frame, and he watched me look at the things that had belonged to the boy he had been. After a moment he said quietly that the boy who had lived in this room would have liked me. He said the man who lived in the house now was trying very hard to deserve that. I turned and looked at him. He was leaning in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, and the light from the hall fell across the side of his face in a way that made him look tired and young at the same time. I told him that the boy who had lived in this room had done a great deal of growing since then. I told him that I had seen it. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he smiled, the same private smile I had seen outside the hospital, and he stepped back into the hall and closed the door behind us with a soft click, the way you close a door when you have decided to keep the memory but you do not need to keep the room. That night he walked me to a guest room at the far end of the second floor. It was a room I had not seen on the tour, because he had opened the door to it last, almost as an afterthought. It was pale and clean and smelled of lavender, with a bed that looked softer than anything I had ever been offered, and a window that looked out over the same wisteria I had seen from the front of the house. He stood in the doorway for a moment, uncertain in a way I had not yet seen him uncertain, and then he said that if I needed anything at all, there was a bell pull beside the bed that would ring down to the kitchen. He said he would be in his study at the end of the hall. He said he would leave the door open. Then he said good night, in a voice that was almost a whisper, and he left, and his footsteps faded down the corridor, and the house settled into the deep quiet of a place that had been waiting a long time to be full again. I closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without turning on the light. The moon was coming through the window in a thin, pale bar across the floor, and I watched it move, slowly, as the minutes passed. I thought about the hospital room I had left that morning. I thought about the humming of the fluorescent light above my bed. I thought about how I had lain there 9 days earlier, and believed that no one in the world was coming for me, and how wrong I had been, and how strange it was to be here now, in a house that smelled of lavender and old wood, with a man at the end of the hall who had left his door open so that I would not feel alone. I undressed slowly, and I slid beneath the covers of the bed, and the sheets were cool and clean and soft in a way I had forgotten sheets could be, and I lay there for a long time, listening to the house. There were small sounds, the kind of sounds a house makes when it has been empty for a long time, and is slowly remembering what it is to be lived in. Clock ticked somewhere on the ground floor. A floorboard settled. The wisteria outside the window tapped once against the glass and then went still. Somewhere far down the hall I heard the low murmur of a page being turned, and I knew he was in his study, reading, the way he read when he could not sleep, and I let the sound of it carry me the rest of the way into the dark. I slept without dreaming for the first time in 9 days. The next morning I woke to the smell of coffee, and to the sound of someone moving carefully through the kitchen below me. I lay still for a moment, listening, and then I rose and washed my face in the small bathroom beside the guest room and put on the clothes I had been discharged in, which were the only clothes I owned in the world. When I came down the stairs, he was standing at the kitchen counter with his back to me, pouring coffee into 2 cups that did not match. He turned when he heard me on the last step, and his face did something I had not seen it do before. It relaxed. It was the smallest possible movement, a softening around the eyes, a quiet unclenching of the jaw, and it told me, more clearly than any words could have, that he had not been sure, until that moment, that I would still be there. "Good morning," he said. He handed me a cup. The coffee was strong and hot, and exactly the way I had always taken it, which I had not told him, which meant he had noticed anyway, somewhere along the way, without my having to explain. We sat at the small kitchen table and we drank our coffee, and we did not talk about the night before or about what was going to happen next. We talked about small things. He asked me whether I had slept, and I told him I had. He told me that he had not, and that it was not because of anything I had done, and that he had not slept well for many years, and that he had made his peace with it a long time ago. I asked him if there was anything I could do to help, and he looked at me over the rim of his cup and said, very simply, that there was not, that the only thing that had helped in years was the fact that I was sitting across from him at this particular table on this particular morning, and that he had not realized how much he had needed that until it was already happening. I set my cup down. I told him I could not stay in this house forever. I told him that I had a life I had left behind, an apartment I had not paid rent on in 9 days, a job I had not shown up to in 9 days, an entire ordinary life that had not stopped simply because mine had fallen apart. I told him I would need to go back to it. I told him I would need to find a way to make it work. He listened to all of it without interrupting, and when I had finished, he only nodded. He said he understood. He said he had not brought me here to keep me. He said he had brought me here to give me a place to begin again, and that beginning, he knew, would eventually mean leaving. He said he would help me in whatever way I asked him to, and that the kind of help I asked for would tell him everything he needed to know about who I was and who I intended to remain. I thought about that. I sat with it for a long time. I thought about the kind of help I would have asked for a year earlier, the kind of help that came with strings, the kind of help that turned a person into a thing that belonged to someone else. I thought about the apartment I had rented at the edge of the city, the small one with the radiator that clicked at night, and the window that looked out over a fire escape I had never once climbed. I thought about the diner where I had worked the early shift for the last 3 years. The same counter, the same coffee pots, the same regulars who came in at 6 in the morning and ordered the same breakfast every day and treated me, when they remembered to, like I was part of the furniture. I had loved that job in a quiet, tired way. I had loved it because it had been mine, because I had earned it, because no one had given it to me out of pity. I looked at him across the table. I told him I wanted to go back to my apartment. I told him I wanted to go back to my job. I told him I wanted to pay my own rent and buy my own groceries and live the kind of life I had been living before the hospital, the kind of life that was small and ordinary and mine. I told him I would not ask him for a single cent. I told him that if he wanted to help me, the best thing he could do was let me try. He listened. He did not interrupt. When I had finished, he nodded, slowly, the way a man nods when he has heard something that has confirmed what he had hoped to hear. He said he would drive me back to the city that afternoon. He said he would not try to change my mind. He said he would be there if I wanted him to be, in whatever shape I wanted him to be, for as long as I wanted him to be there, and that if I wanted him to disappear, he would disappear too, completely, without resentment, because he had never intended to be a weight in my life. I told him I did not want him to disappear. I told him I had not had anyone in my life for so long that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to want someone to stay, and that I was not ready to give that up just because I was walking back into a small apartment on the far side of the city. He set his cup down on the table. He looked at me. He said, in a voice that was barely louder than the ticking of the kitchen clock, that he would not disappear. He said it as if he were saying a thing he had already decided, a long time ago, perhaps in the back of a black car outside a restaurant he had never entered, watching a woman he had never spoken to kneel on the pavement and give away the last of what she had. We finished our coffee. He washed the cups. I dried them. We did this without speaking, the way two people do small things together when they have just promised each other something larger than either of them can yet name. Then he went to fetch the car, and I went upstairs to gather my few things. And when I came back down the stairs with my plastic bag of belongings in my hand, he was waiting for me at the front door with his coat on and the keys in his hand, and he looked at me the way he had looked at me the afternoon before in the hospital, except that now there was something settled in his face, something that had been unsettled for a long time and was finally, slowly, coming to rest. The drive back to the city took less than an hour. We did not speak much. The wisteria fell away behind us, and the old stone walls, and the river, and then we were on the highway. And then we were on the smaller roads, and then we were on the streets I recognized, the streets I had walked every morning on my way to the diner, the streets I had crossed every evening on my way home. He pulled up in front of my building, and the building looked smaller than I had remembered it, and the awning over the door was more faded than I had remembered it, and the window of my third-floor apartment was just as I had left it, with the curtain half drawn and a thin line of light showing through the gap. He turned off the engine. He did not move to get out. I opened the door. I stepped out onto the sidewalk. I turned back to him. He was sitting behind the wheel with his hands still resting on it, And he was looking at me the way he had looked at the photograph in the hallway of his house, the way a man looks at a thing he is afraid of losing now that he has finally allowed himself to find it. I asked him if he wanted to come up. He said he did, very much. But he was not going to, not tonight. He said he wanted me to have my apartment back first. The way it had been. The way it was mine. He said he would come back tomorrow if I wanted him to, and that he would knock on the door like any other person, and that he would wait to be let in, because that was the kind of man he wanted to learn to be for me. I closed the car door. I walked up the steps to my building. I turned the key in the lock, the same key, and the door opened with the same small creak it had always made. And the apartment beyond it smelled of dust and closed windows, and the faint memory of the tea I had been drinking on the morning I had first felt the illness take hold of me. I set the plastic bag down on the kitchen counter. I stood in the middle of the room. I breathed in the small, ordinary smell of my own home, and I felt, for the first time in 9 days, that I was somewhere that was mine. I did not unpack the bag that night. I only sat on the edge of my bed, and I looked out the window at the fire escape and the small square of sky above it, and I listened to the radiator click in the wall the way it always had. And I thought about the man who had driven me back to this place and then let me walk through the door alone. I thought about how he had said he would knock on my door tomorrow, like any other person, and how I had believed him, and how I was going to wait for that knock with the same kind of patience I had once reserved for things I was afraid to want. The next morning I went back to the diner. I stood outside the glass door for a moment before I went in, looking at the counter, the stools, the small bell that rang above the door when you pushed it open. I had not been sure, until that moment, that they would still want me back. I had not been sure, until that moment, that anything in the world still wanted me back. I pushed the door open. The bell rang. The woman behind the counter looked up. She looked at me for a long second, and then her face softened, and she said my name. And she asked me where I had been, and I told her I had been sick, and she nodded, and she told me she had been worried, and she handed me an apron. I tied the apron around my waist. I walked behind the counter. I picked up the coffee pot. I poured the first cup of the day for the man at the end of the row who always ordered the same breakfast and treated me, when he remembered to, like I was part of the furniture. I set the cup down in front of him. He nodded without looking up from his newspaper, the way he always did. I went on to the next customer. I went on to the next one after that. At 6 in the evening, when my shift ended, I walked the 4 blocks back to my apartment in the long slant of late summer light, and I found a man standing on the steps of my building, in a coat that did not belong to this street, with his hands in his pockets, looking up at my window. I walked up to him. He turned when he heard my footsteps, and he smiled, the same quiet, private smile, and he said that he had come to knock on my door, the way he had promised. He said he had been standing there for 10 minutes, working up the courage. I told him he did not need to knock. I told him the door was already open.